And I want to invite to the screen my colleagues Kurt and Elizabeth, and our colleague Sarah is also in here on chat, but will not be on screen. So I'm excited that we can do this together. So hi guys.
Hey.
Hello, my morbid, creepy friends.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
It's a little bit scary how geeked out I get about this, so I apologize in advance. Kurt, don't you have something you want to share with the group?
I do. This will probably help set a context, perhaps for some discussion or some levity. But I ran across this years ago, and you know what they say in real estate? What are the three most important things? Location, location, location. Well, kind of the same thing when we talk about death and dying as it relates to us finding our family stories. We know, or I hope we all know, how important it is to really pay attention in the cemetery, not just to the stone, but the front of the stone, the side of the stone, the back of the stone, and who are all the neighbors? You know, we talk about living people as, you know, the fans thing, friends, associates, and neighbors. Well, in the cemetery, you know, the neighbors do count a lot. So pay attention to that. And if I can springboard just a little bit off of that, when you're paying attention to neighbors, also, like as we do with living people, look around. Like, are these family plots inside another plot that may not be so eye visible? Is it a Catholic cemetery? So in Catholic cemeteries over in Ohio that I've visited in the past, if a large church has its own cemetery, the family will have plots. But if there's like a general overall Catholic cemetery, sometimes family plots from a particular church are inside the church plot in the larger Catholic cemetery. So ridiculous, crazy things with proximity, location, location, location. So that applies to our dead family members as well as our living family members.
Well, and I think like an important thing when you like look at cemeteries, not just looking at everyone around, but the headstones themselves, what is on them beyond just the names. You'll have some fun symbols, sometimes Masonic symbols, sometimes not Masonic symbols, other fraternal groups, different societies that people might be a part of, mutual aid societies are fun ones. And you can kind of piece together what was this person involved with in their life.
Oh yeah.
I'm actually going to put a link to an article that's like, it's 86 examples of headstone symbolism explained as kind of a primer. Is that for anyone interested in that?
Billion Graves?
No.
Okay, there's one on Billion Graves website. We've had Kathy Wallace from Billion Graves has been a presenter for us before, and she has some really cool examples. So
this is just a different one.
Yeah, and
there are loads of these.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites for what you were just talking about.
Oh yeah,
Elizabeth. Amazing numbers of symbols, iconography in this book, and you can really impress your friends, or you can try to work this into some kind of bar trivia. You know, impress people by saying you're an expert in tombstone iconography. They'll be really impressed.
Independent Order of Oddfellows. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Cool. So it looks like we already have a question in the chat now.
Sure.
Couple things, friends. Put your questions in the Q&A box throughout the program, just because your questions might get lost in the chat, and we like that you guys like to share resources and have conversation in the chat. So use the chat button for that, but you put your questions for us in that Q&A box, as a couple people have already done.
Yay.
So,
and we'll keep watching the chat, but it doesn't mean that we'll actually see it, because if we have a lot of stuff popping through, we miss stuff. So just make sure that you put it in the Q&A.
Yeah. So the first question I see is a very familiar question that I've heard before, saying that they can't find a death record for an ancestor who died in southern Indiana around 1855. They're convinced he's buried in a graveyard that at the time was farmland of his oldest son in a nearby county to where he was living. how likely or unlikely. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of cemeteries, especially in places like the Midwest, so places that are not in a city, right? Where you're going to have cemeteries that were on private land at one point, that are on farms. So yeah, that's likely.
I will also say you will probably not find a death record for that ancestor. Indiana didn't have death records until in 1882. 1907 is really when that law kind of came into play. And honestly, a lot of places, especially rural areas, were not compliant until around the 1920s. So you're really not going to find a death record for that time period. Your best bet truly is to scour the newspapers, look, and see what you can find. And it says, it looks like there's a couple counties in question. You got a lot of places to look.
Just a couple of quick tips that if you haven't considered these, would certainly be worthy of exploring. So the Indiana Department of Natural Resources has an individual who has compiled a database of cemeteries all over Indiana, even the abandoned ones, small ones. Does she have them all? No. But it's a great start. The Indiana Genealogical Society also has cemetery locator resources. They also have a county genealogist program for the counties that you might be interested in. So go to their website and see. It's free to explore that on their website. Also, in every single county in Indiana, the township trustee by code is ultimately responsible for cemeteries. Now, that can mean a whole lot of different things. Responsible means, yeah, I'll get to it someday. Or you remember the old jokes about the round to it, get yourself around to it. I'll get around to it, and they never get the round to it. But those are good resources. And also check with the Indiana Historical Society's county historian program. They have a county historian for most every county between the Indiana Genealogical Society's county genealogist and the Historical Society's county historian. You may have some resources there that might be able to help you. And finally, something I always forget, find a long-standing funeral home in the area and ask the funeral directors. They know so much. I mean, pun intended, they know literally where the bodies are buried. That's what they do.
So the next one, any ideas for announcements of the reinterment of Civil War Union soldiers? Have the cemetery records, military records probate, but never found a formal notice in the local papers, assuming they would want the comrades there. Was reinterred October of 1865. Thank you.
I'm not sure I'm following the question. They're looking for the announcement. They have where the grave has been reinterred, I would assume from that question, right?
Yeah, it looks like they're trying to find out if there was a formal notice in the newspaper. There wasn't necessarily. You're looking at a time period where it's 1865. The country is not, the country is not in a good place. There may have not been space in the local newspaper for something like this. And also it was common.
Yeah.
And I know that, Crystal, you're looking for a newspaper announcement, but expanding your scope just a little bit might help get you some kind of much later announcement. Is there a GAR post nearby in the area? And did they have some kind of commemorative activity for Union soldiers that were reinterred, honoring them, mentioning them, trying to gather units back together in an article? I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities. I just don't know what you're looking for in the way of an announcement, unless it's just you'd like to see the newspaper announcement. As my colleagues have said, it doesn't necessarily have to appear in the paper, I mean, for that time period.
Right. And also, we don't know what newspapers you've looked through. If you're just looking at what's online, there's probably a lot of stuff that isn't digitized for the time frame. And even what is digitized, it might not even be all of it. So for that, I would recommend looking in the Library of Congress's US newspaper directory for the county and see what's going on. So I'm going to put a link to that in the chat for anybody who might need that, because it'll list what papers might have existed and where you can find them, either a microfilm or some other format, what libraries might have them, what archives might have them,
Right.
because it's possible that you're just barely scratching the surface of what newspapers are there.
The second wife of my great grandfather died between 1947 and 1952. Her gravestone is with her previous husband for 1952. But on the 1950 census, Grandpa identifies as a widower. This is Vigo County. Where else to look? Can find nothing for her under any of her names.
Well, maybe there's a mistake on the headstone for the date. Or he's
Also-
claiming to be a widower and they're not together.
Or
Right.
they could be together and she could be at a hospital of some sort,
Yeah.
receiving care.
Yeah.
There's a lot of possibilities. With the 1950 census, that's so recently been released,
Yeah.
I would still keep searching for her on there, because it is possible that she's there somewhere. I mean, it could be a mistake on the headstone, so she could have already been deceased, but there's a strong possibility that she's somewhere else.
And again, as I think both of you are, I'm a big fan of networking. I mean, who knows what they have, but the Wabash Valley Genealogical Societies, oh my goodness. That organization, which is a conglomerate of counties, Vigo being one of them, Wabash Valley Genealogical Society, they have done so much research. They have so many people looking around doing things. If you haven't queried them, I mean, you have nothing to lose. Shoot them a query. They're an awesome group. They have, gosh, Allison and Elizabeth, I'm blanking on it. They used to have their own really robust digital site, but I think they're part of Indiana Memory now. So if you go to the state library's website, just Google Indiana Memory. I believe a lot of their collections are on Indiana Memory now, and you might find things there if you haven't already looked. But always take an opportunity to pick someone else's brain for some ideas, as you're doing tonight, right?
Which, for the person who had asked the previous question, Crystal, she had actually put a follow-up thing in the chat about saying that she thought maybe a funeral service. And I was gonna actually suggest maybe contacting the Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania and see if maybe they had any ideas of some local resources, or maybe they know of something specifically.
Right.
And
which I'm putting a link to that in the chat.
Yes, 100%. But I also just don't want you to get your hopes up. There is a possibility there wasn't a formal service.
Yeah.
And I like somebody's suggestion about the GAR post. See if there's anything there. And Sons of the Union Soldiers of the Civil War. There's some great suggestions.
Yeah.
So please follow up with all of those.
So we're gonna kind of skip around in some of these questions. Just so we can try to get through as many of your wonderful questions as possible. Let's see, any tips on finding a deceased relative when you do not know when they may have died? Depends on the gender, in my opinion. Like, depends on, are we talking about a man or a woman? Men, you can maybe look for a probate record if maybe they had property, had a will. Women, you can do that as well, but you might not find that for a woman.
I'm guessing you have a range, like there's got to be a time range. And I
Right.
think that also is dependent on whether there'd be records, man or woman. So I think
Yeah.
that would be something that you'd have to look into.
Oh, this is an interesting question. Somebody asked, were most obituaries published for free in the 18 to 1900s. So was it free to publish an obituary in the 19th century and early 20th century? Nothing is ever free.
Yeah, hard to say. They're way more expensive now across the board than usual, or excuse me, than historically. A lot of small town newspapers in this country was pretty agrarian and still is for a long time. So our contemporary, picture of the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and the Indy Star, I mean, those typically weren't common papers, and or papers that covered common people, everyday people that lived in farmland and agrarian areas. You'd be absolutely surprised that obituaries tend to actually appear like news stories. The obituary of my paternal grandfather, who I never met because he died before my parents were even married. His obituary is pretty amazing, and it was started on page 1. It wasn't grouped with a bunch of obituaries. It was good old Valentine Witcher. In fact, I think I'm going to go ahead and see if I can't find a quick picture of good old Val just to show. And this was a regular old, I mean, it looks every much like a newspaper article, news event, if you will. You'll have to pardon the, here we go. You'll have to pardon the arrows I have drawn on it, but do you see that on the screen? So, yeah, I mean, here's his death being announced. This is typical of, mid 20th century and earlier papers. This is what he was doing when he died, visiting his daughter in Buffalo, confined to a hospital. And you have this little wonderful genealogical paragraph, who his parents were, including his mother's maiden name, and back on to page 12 for the rest of it, surviving his wife, etc. The body is at Betcher and Sons Mortuary. The Oblates of St. Benedict will recite office. That's a good Baptist organization, right? Oblates of St. Benedict. No, that's about as Catholic as you can get. And if you didn't know that trigger as Catholic, down a few lines, St. Joseph Society will recite a rosary. Yeah, that's pretty Catholic. So, and this was again on page 1. So it's look through the papers for newsy type articles. Look through all the small papers you can find, and it's getting easier and easier with so many memory projects, so many digitization projects, state libraries, state archives, state memory projects. There's just a lot of data out there.
And a lot of times it's just a death notice. It's just a brief line saying this person died. Not everybody could afford the obituary. Not everybody had the time to write one, put it in. So they're kind of a newer item. I'd say Victorian.
Yeah, Victorian into the turn of the century. And I think also, like somebody had mentioned in the chat, that sometimes these death announcements, they are considered news in a town, especially a small town or even like a mid-sized city. So like, oh, you wouldn't be paying for that. Depends. But one thing I do want to show really quick is this is from a program I gave a while back on incorporating newspapers into your DNA research. This type of thing, this a word of thanks. There were, when my great grandmother died, there was more than one death announcement. She died not super long after childbirth, like several months afterwards, but she died of tuberculosis. It was a whole thing, leaving a number of children, and she was in this family that was kind of like well-to-do, from what it seems like, at least in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So after she died, they did this like thank you card thing in the paper. This is the type of thing you'd probably have to pay for. If you didn't have to pay for an obituary, you certainly would have to pay for this. And what I found interesting about this particular like thank you card is that they made a point to sign it John S. Haley, which was her husband, and put her sister's name, Mary Robinson. The reason why they did that is because in the obituary, they actually got her name wrong. She was Miss Mary Robertson and was a particularly sweet and attractive girl, a lovely wife and mother, yada, yada, yada. No, her name was Claudia, not Mary. They got the two women confused. So they actually issued a correction in the paper, which I found kind of interesting. Yeah, this program is on YouTube if you're ever interested in watching this.
Heirs in newspapers? Are you kidding me? Heirs in secondary
Yeah,
sources?
What
Who
is
would have
that?
thought?
Yeah.
Rolling,
What is that?
rolling.
And I'm sorry, what?
I was going to say, rolling back a half a step to just before what Elizabeth said. The smaller the town, usually the more robust the reporting is.
Mhm.
So Hartford City, Indiana is close to Fort Wayne, but look at all these column inches for their county historian, not their mayor, not their police chief, not their superintendent, but Cecil Beeson, great guy, knew everything about Blackford County, had post office box number 1, I mean, but he was just like us, an everyday guy who did, worked every day, raised a family. But small town newspaper, oh my goodness. You have, in the research terms, in the research world, you have dozens of actionable items in that obituary, which is a newspaper news column, really.
This is on the funeral home website still, which is kind of awesome. At home, I have this laminated because that's what my family does, but this was my grandmother's obituary.
Holy cow, that's an amazing amount of data.
My grandfather's was just as long.
Yeah.
I saw in the chat that somebody said something of note. So A, small town. B, their friend wrote both of them. So sometimes if you're friends with a journalist, you end up with a really amazing obituary.
My grandfather had 2, both written by journalists that he was friends with, and they were long.
Mhm.
Yeah. I did see somebody ask in the chat, and I'm going to use this as a reminder for everyone, for anyone who might be just joining us, use the Q&A box for questions and use the chat for chatting, because we'll also put links to resources in the chat. So that's what the chat is good for, but put your questions in the Q&A box for that. But the question I saw in the chat, which I've now already lost, was essentially asking, present day, are there still newspapers that publish all deaths? I assume they mean, I'm not sure what they mean, because there were some papers I've seen in the 19th century that would just produce like a list of people who've died, not necessarily obituaries. But I'm gonna say no. If that's how I'm understanding the question.
And also, I want to give you guys a heads up. There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and we are going through them. We're grouping them together in some cases. So if we don't get to yours right away, we're still going through them. So don't worry. We see that they're coming through.
And some we're answering via the chat feature.
Yes.
Or the Q&A feature, I should say.
And somebody asked if it's going to hinder future researchers on finding information about their ancestors because of the charging for the obituaries. Yeah, it's entirely possible. I mean, the more expensive they are, the less likely people are going to do that. Some people may know or not know, but my mother recently passed away. Her obituary was over $700. Would I pay that again? In a heartbeat.
I saw that question, Allison, and I was going to kind of just look over it right now. But since you brought it up, I think you invited me onto my mini little soapbox here. And so I'm going to try to stay on focus. But yeah, you make a great point, Allison, and the person who asked the question. And I'm going to ask another question to answer the question, which they say is improper. And what are we going to do about it? That's my question. And what are we going to do about it? I saw floating through the chat. Maybe I should write my own obituary. LOL. Well, maybe you should. And maybe you should share it with your family members. And again, the 1950 census was just released. Every time, if you're paying attention, you'll see Congress looked at it again, but Congress is generally so dysfunctional, they can't have more than a tsetse fly's worth of attention to anything. But do we really need to do these censuses? Because all we need to do is figure out where the population shifted, and statisticians and demographers for years have been able to do a more accurate count than enumerators. Some year that switch is going to flip, some census year. So maybe in 2030, they'll say, you know, we don't need to do these enumerations anymore. And what are we going to do about that? We should have ways of telling our stories, finding, presenting, preserving our stories. That's what the three of us and our colleagues say all the time. History is in our hands. I mean, we can push it off on someone else, but history is in our hands. So how are we memorializing, recording, documenting, evidencing the deaths of our family members? Well, what are we doing about that? It's a serious issue. To poke people several years ago, I said, you know, we, us living on this call, we could be the first part of the dark ages, the digital dark ages. So when our grandchildren's grandchildren come back to look for us, what are they going to find? You know, it's a serious question.
I think I see a question here that I think needs to be clarified for some people.
Okay.
What is the difference between an obituary and a death notice?
A death notice is usually just a notification that a person died so that creditors and mourners can, to be redundant, be notified. It may say where the funeral is going to take place, but there's no cause, there's no family members, typically. It's just a notice of the death. They're often used interchangeably, sort of like obituary and death record are used interchangeably. Technically, when most people who do research talk about a death record, they're talking about a civil vital record registration called a death record. And as Allison mentioned earlier, you know, Indiana, for example, 1881, 82, that was when it was mandated to be kept. Mandated doesn't mean it was kept. I think Ohio was 1863, if I remember correctly, or somewhere around there, mandated. But again, years later is when it's actually enforced. So notice is usually briefer. Usually the family doesn't have to pay for it. It's just notifications. If you want ancestors, descendants, survived by, preceded by, etc., that's an obituary, which you may or may not have to pay for.
Oh, I see a question I'm excited for. I'm excited for all of them, but so as some of you, as most of you probably wouldn't know, I'm just absolutely fascinated by historic diseases and how diseases are listed on death certificates. I'm like fascinated by it, grossed out by it, but like a grossed out in a love type way. I don't even know how to describe it. Somebody had asked if there was a website that we can refer to people that would translate some of these archaic terms for diseases into something that's more scientific present day. There is a list of different websites on Cindy's list, which I'll put a link to in the chat. But Allison, did you have something specific?
Oh my gosh. So for deaths, let me pull that up. I have a couple of books that I think are really interesting. There's one called Death Certificates in Archaic Medical Terms, and another one called a Medical Miscellany for genealogists. I'm butchering that. Ignore how I pronounce it, but I'm going to put these in the chat. So these are books. And because I'm a librarian, I like books. But also Google. Google is your friend.
Yeah.
Just Google these types of words and be like, what is this?
Medical miscellanea.
Even
right?
Yeah,
if you
I'm
don't know exactly, like, if you're having issues reading a death certificate, which I guess I think there's one I can show you an example of that I have like handy. Okay. This was actually from that program I was talking about earlier, the one where I was talking about newspapers and DNA. I talked a lot about death during that program and various things. So this is a death certificate for my great grandmother's twin brother. He was only 3 months old when he died. Now, this is his cause of death. And the handwriting is kind of hard to read. And then you have gastroenteritis. Knowing that his mother probably had TB at the time of his birth and certainly during her pregnancy. And the reason why I know that is because I found a notice in the newspaper so he would have been born in September of 1911. By October, his mother was being shipped off to Birmingham to an open air camp to receive treatment. So an open air camp is probably going to be a tuberculosis, facility of some sort, which that one in particular wasn't a facility yet. It was literally tents, but I digress. I had a conversation with my sister, who's a nurse, and she said that the way this is worded, even though you can't really read this, it's probably intestinal tuberculosis, which is something that children can be born with. So just looking at some of the stuff and doing some Googling and maybe asking around, maybe ask like next time you're at your doctor's office, be like, hey, what does this mean? Not for me, but like, for my ancestor who died like 100 years ago. What does that mean? Not saying to go book appointments with your doctors to do that, but if you happen to know someone who is in the medical profession, they might be able to give you some advice or some thoughts, or they could help you figure out the right types of search terms to Google, or you can also email us because we're morbid and we love things like this. So you can always reach out to us and ask, hey, I'm trying to figure out what this cause of death is. What do you think it is? And we can look into it and maybe give you some ideas.
There's some really weird ones out there. I have an ancestor who flooded to death.
Flooded to death?
Yes, flooded to death. Took me a while to figure out what that was. She bled to death during childbirth.
Oh. She hemorrhaged. Okay, she hemorrhaged.
Yeah, but I'd never heard of it that way, that terminology. So death certificates are real fancy and weird.
Yeah.
And just hearkening back to take advantage in a positive way of funeral directors, funeral home directors, and funeral home records. Funeral home records can often almost look like a death record. Who paid for this particular funeral? So-and-so, parentheses, mother, so-and-so, parentheses, sister, brother. But also funeral directors, morticians, funeral home workers, they may be able to help you decipher some of those weird looking odd spelled, interesting sounding diseases. They're an amazing resource that, I don't mean to be, well, I do mean to be morbid, so I'll just own that. They kind of like to keep people feeling comfortable with interacting with them because maybe you'll give them your business someday.
In fact, for those of you who do not know, there is a YouTuber who has a channel called Ask a Mortician, my husband. And my husband's very much obsessed with Ask a Mortician. She is fascinating. Her videos are very informative. It talks about not just present day funeral home practices, but also funeral customs, burial customs, historic present day. It's really good stuff. I'm going to put a link to her YouTube channel into the chat for those who might not be familiar with her, but she's great. And I see other people in the chat saying she's awesome. She's awesome.
She is. She's fascinating. It's things that you would never think of, or things that you never think to ask, because, our minds just don't automatically go to with like, I don't know, how do they keep their eyes shut type of thing? I don't know.
Well, and secret is, and I heard this from StoryCorps, secret is sometimes they can't keep their eyes shut. So they have to do special procedures.
We'll just call it magic for now.
Yeah. As opposed to postmortem surgery, but yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, it's
Kind
kind
of-
of a whole nother.
In the same like vein as like morticians and things, somebody asked if you can easily access autopsy records. That depends on one, if an autopsy was done, and two, I think you can only access them, now I can be wrong, if you're family of the deceased. Am I incorrect on that?
You are correct and incorrect at the same time.
Okay.
And that's wonderful when that happens. So the best answer in my experience, both surveying and actually digging for them, is it depends. There are some jurisdictions, I think counties in Missouri post them online. And then other counties and states are like, who are you? Why do you want this? You
Yeah.
know, next of kin? Do you have a legal matter involving this? Yeah, it can be interesting. I believe, and maybe I should put a big asterisk after this. I haven't researched this particular thing, so I don't know for sure. I bet the legal genealogist would know. She is awesome. If you don't follow her, you should. Judy Russell. She just had a presentation for our local society last evening. Just really a great mind and a great genealogist. I believe in most jurisdictions, it's somewhere in the code that they need to be made available to those who want them, but needing to be made available and actually being available might not be the same exact thing, as in you might need to really press to get them.
Yeah.
Coroner's records here in Allen County, for example, you need to interact directly with the coroner's office, and they'll make the decision whether or not you can see them or what parts of them you can see. And I think it's very dependent on coroner, jurisdiction, etc. Have either one of you had luck going after coroner's records for any tangent family members? Tangent lines, direct lines?
Emily.
So, and someone actually brought up the exact example I was going to give, was that in New York City, if you request a death certificate and there's a medical examiner's number, you can request all associated documentation. So that would include the coroner's report, and if it was like a police related thing, if there's a police report, that would be included as well.
Okay.
Yeah. But I haven't, because a lot of my like immediate ancestors, aside from my great aunt, I didn't have autopsies.
Right.
Yeah,
And
because there
that-
wasn't a need.
And that's a great point, Elizabeth. I think sometimes we think, oh, well, sudden death, well, you're going to have an autopsy, or person was young, going to have an autopsy. I think if we look carefully, it's an unnatural death that triggers an autopsy. So if there's something obvious, it can be a weird situation. It can be young. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Because I think with my great aunt, there was question as to whether or not her abusive husband had something to do with her death. And that is why one would have been done. But that would have been in New Orleans. And I don't think I could have requested that. The only person who can would be my cousins.
Okay.
Because they would be the direct line.
Right.
And they're still alive. So
So I just threw the database for the Allen County, Indiana Coroner Records database. It ends in 1949. Like it stops there. You know, people don't exactly want these online. These are summaries.
Right.
Just if you wanted to look around and see what types of pieces of information you might get out of a coroner's report.
And again, I don't know where specifically it's codified. But we did get permission from the coroner's office to post that index abstract online. And if you want, say, hey, that's my person, I want to see the actual coroner's inquest report, that's a query to the coroner's office in Allen County.
Mhm. So that's
Some-
just an example for
Right.
one place.
Right.
Someone brought up something kind of important in the chat about how pre-COVID in this county in Ohio, there was a 6-week backlog for issuing death certificates due to the opioid crisis. So things like that, and also natural disasters. So as someone who lived in Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina, I can tell you that there was a backlog of issuing death certificates, and there was a backlog of also identifying bodies. So you have to kind of keep in mind when looking for things that are more recent that maybe you're having issues finding what was going on at that time frame. You know, was there some type of natural disaster, for example, or something else happening like a pandemic or the opioid crisis? Like, what's going on in that place where that person would have died? There are some questions in the Q&A that I think we should get to, because I'm kind of curious to see what
Sure.
Kurt and Allison's thoughts are.
I'm really excited about one of them.
The ones I was going to ask had to do with finding cemeteries or burial plots for formerly enslaved or enslaved individuals. Do you guys have thoughts or like tips on maybe how? Because the one person in particular said that they were from Massachusetts, or that they're a genealogist in Massachusetts specifically.
So I personally have not specifically worked on that kind of a query, but I'm just going to talk strategy. So where did the African-American family live? And if it was multiple places, there you have multiple places to check. Was there an extended family that was close, and even an extended family that wasn't close? Could there be a burial plot on somebody's land? What were the burial codes? Remember, post-Civil War, there was the Reconstruction time period, then the Jim Crow time period. In some jurisdictions, I can't tell you how many, whether it's over half, less than half, African Americans were not allowed to be buried in certain cemeteries. They may have their own section in other cemeteries. As we move into the mid to late 20th century, a lot of cemeteries, African Americans liked the fact that they had their own section. I'll give you just an example. Again, this is not Elizabeth directly answering the question, but our own really large cemetery here in Allen County that's so awesome. It's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. Lindenwood Cemetery has its own African-American section crossing Jordan. It's amazing on so many levels. The names, the headstones, the stories that you can see, that you can get out of those headstones. Does that mean all African-Americans were buried in that section? No, it does not. So you have to watch for the special sections, and then watch to see maybe they weren't buried in a designated African-American section. Were there African-American cemeteries, totalities, in the areas where you believe or you want to look for your ancestor? So those are some of the tips. There is so much really awesome information being published and researched on African-American families. Take advantage of those networks. There's just an awesome amount of people that are researching every aspect of African-American lives. Did you have something, Allison?
I was just going to add, making sure to contact the people that are local that might know where these cemeteries might be, burial plots, etc., and getting an idea of the local history, understanding what was going on locally and talking to the locals. I think that would be
Absolutely
really, really helpful.
No.
Yeah, because one
Extremely
example.
Great point.
Yeah, because like one example that came to mind for me immediately as someone who's originally from the New Orleans area was this New Orleans cemetery database project that's been going on. And it has to do with the St. Louis cemetery because you did have African Americans buried there. So they're working on building this database to make it a resource for people to use, to try to find people who were formerly enslaved or free people of color were buried there as well.
And
Which I could put a link to that in the chat if anyone's curious.
it's so important to always context. That's such great points that you both made. Keep context front of mind. And I think it's true in all of our research, but particularly true in our African-American research. There were many occasions, and they're finding them all the time, where African-American burial plots, if they weren't well known, and even if they were well known, sometimes they'd just be plowed over for a building project, for a highway, for expressways, for interchanges, for shopping malls. And we've seen in the late 20th century and into the 21st century here, a lot of movements to recover those names, those bones, those stones, and those stories. So again, get plugged into people and organizations in the area. I had to smile inside my head, Allison, when we were talking about, talk to the people in the area. Our local African-American Genealogical Society of Fort Wayne is modest in size, but mighty, absolutely mighty in the amount of information they know. A couple members, and I won't out them here in this program, but you throw out a name and they can tell you like 2, 3, 4 generations of, oh yeah, their great whomever was my great grandma's this person, and they went to church over here and they're buried over there and they work here. So take advantage of those networks.
Somebody asked another question about diseases that was specific to children. Let's see, I have many ancestors whose children died young. Is there a way to learn about major diseases that swept through the states and the nation over the last couple of centuries that might explain these deaths? Yes. Google is your friend. There's a specific article I'm putting in the link. I'm putting a link to in the chat. That's called The History of Pediatric Infectious Diseases. Because what some of these diseases mean, you kind of also have to kind of put it into context. So for example, when I worked at the Tenement Museum, one of the families we talked about was the Moore family. It was an Irish immigrant family that lived in that building for a couple of years. And the one absolute concrete thing that the museum knew about the family is that they had a baby that died while living in 97 Orchard. Now that child's death certificate said that she died of 2 things, 2 causes of death, marasmus and scrofula. Now, scrofula, best like non-medical, not coming from medical professional definition of that or explanation is basically, it's a form of sort of TB that kids can get from putting dirty stuff in their mouth, which kids put dirty stuff in their mouth all the time, right? That's the thing that children do, right? Don't ever Google scrofula and then look at the Google images, because you will be intensely grossed out because it causes a rash and it makes your neck swell huge. Marasmus is a form of malnutrition. So if your neck is swollen, you're going to have issues swallowing. So you're not going to necessarily be able to get nutrients, right? So it's not that, oh, these people are poor, so the kid couldn't eat. That wasn't the case. The child was sick with multiple things. And also the museum believed that the mother might have been sick herself. She might not have been able to produce like as much breast milk as she might have, like if she was perfectly healthy. And the reason why they thought that was because she died pretty young. She died in her, like 30 years old of a heart attack. So yeah. So it's kind of important to kind of keep in mind a lot of the layers to that. And also let's think about the time frame. So this would have been the late 1860s. And, in a time frame where you wouldn't necessarily be able to afford a doctor. And let's be real, a lot of the doctors just declared themselves doctors. They weren't actual medical professionals. You got your medical advice from the women in your life, from your mother, from your neighbors, maybe a grandmother. This was an Irish mother who didn't have any living relatives that the museum was aware of that lived around. And she was the only English-speaking, that family is the only English-speaking family in a German building. in a very German neighborhood.
Wow.
She might not have felt comfortable enough to even try to ask the neighbor next door because of cultural differences, language barriers, of course. And frankly, the neighbors next door might not want him to talk to these people, not just because, oh, they're Irish, maybe we don't like them, but that condition would have caused some physical things. No, we don't want this sick kid near our kids, right? Even if there isn't a strong understanding of how diseases are spread, it would look strange. So we're talking about a family that's very much alone. So putting things in this kind of big context is really important when you're looking at things like death certificates. That's my little rant on diseases.
If I can just maybe wrap up your rant, which was an awesome rant, an absolutely awesome rant. When all else fails in UK, okay, I found the pandemic or I found the disease. Which one was it really? Did it really come through my neighborhood, my town? Newspapers. Oh my goodness, the chroniclers of the lives and times of people. So get the Jasper Herald if you're looking for my family. Get the Adair or whatever chronicler for Kentucky and see what it says for the time period that your ancestors were living there or that your ancestor passed. Newspapers are awesome.
Newspapers are.
Agreed.
As we're winding down, I just wanted to say to the people who have some very specific questions that if we do not get to all of your wonderful questions this evening, send us an email. You know, we're always happy to answer your questions through email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'm going to put that in the chat.
Well,
And
you're
also-
doing that.
Yeah.
Yes. I was going to say, I really want to answer this question.
Go.
This question makes me happy. What is a term grave? I know the answer. It's a grave that was leased by the family. And when the family stopped paying, marker was turned over and another body was put on top. You could lease a grave.
Like leasing a car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was generally done with children, babies, stillbirths, etc. But adults did it as well, from what I've researched. But I think it's just really fascinating that this was a thing. You could lease a grave.
The whole
Economical.
monetary business behind death is just interesting.
And I'm just guessing, it's a pure guess that the person most directly involved in that lease transaction, they probably never had any complaints from the individual. Would be my guess.
Not
does make
mad about the
research
eviction
hard.
notice. It does make research very hard. It was done a lot in Europe. It was done a lot in major cities. One interesting example that's not an exact example, an old St. Patrick's Cathedral in what is now present day Little Italy in Manhattan. Several years ago, they started selling burial plots within the crypt. Now, people haven't been buried in Manhattan in a really long time. They made room. So for the low price of $7 million, you can be buried in Old St. Pat's. They kicked out some priests and made room for possible celebrities.
Because that's
There you
a
go.
thing. But the thing is so a lot of people might be up in arms about the research component. A lot of gravestones don't survive. There are gravestones from our ancestors that just did not survive. They were made out of maybe wood, a stone that rubbed away. Maybe they didn't even have a proper gravestone. Maybe it was field stone. Our ancestors, they're not around to care. It's the living that have to deal with what happens after death. So just keep that in mind as you see these things and as you're trying to wrap your head around something that may not make sense to you. It's still something that's affecting. It's the dead person. They don't care.
I see a question in here. What replaced the mortality schedules? Interested in disease outbreaks, diseases, mothers from birth, all ages. the mortality schedules, if you're, I see you capitalize that, and I'm guessing that may be intentional. The mortality schedules were taken in conjunction with the federal population schedules. And it was the government's need to know the health of the nation that triggered that sort of finger on the pulse of the health of the nation. And nothing really replaced them. The government decided that it wasn't going to have a need to collect that information any longer. So I don't think you are Cassandra, but I definitely would not conflate or confuse death records with mortality schedules, because mortality schedules are really a non-population census schedule taken in conjunction with the federal census records. And maybe even some states took their own version of that, but they were taken in conjunction with the federal census records to see how healthy we were and what people were dying of, and how the nation might coalesce around fighting one particular disease or another.
Okay, there's one question in here that kind of entertains me. How do the credit bureaus and creditors know about deaths? Can anyone here say? They're finding out through good old-fashioned research. That's what the death notices initially were for. But I will tell you that according to some people, my grandfather, who died in 91, still is not dead because he's still on their lists. I don't know why, but
Do they
sometimes
think
they
he's
don't
pulling an Elvis or something?
maybe, I don't know. I think it's because his house was purchased by his son. And so
Oh,
there's still somebody with that last name in that house. So maybe they think they're hiding him away or something. I don't know.
or concealing assets.
He's in the cemetery. I know where he is. But,
Well,
oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, kind of like in the same vein, but the opposite, when my great grandfather passed away in 1989. Beforehand, he had told my mother, kind of in passing, when I eventually die, Leslie, do not publish an obituary. And she's like, why? And he said, I don't want people showing up to my funeral looking for handouts. So yeah, not everyone will have an obituary. That's kind of that's a whole other story.
Yes, but mostly so the government knows because of Social Security now, and then once that's reported, and then that can then trickle down with other records depending on who has access to what. So
For the person asking where you would get a copy of a death certificate in New Orleans, depending on when it is, you would have to request it from the Secretary of State of Louisiana. Your other parts of the questions, because it's very specific and we're very short on time, send us an email and I can answer the rest of that question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, Sarah just did us a favor and put the email address into the chat. We are running low on time and there are still some amazing questions and we would love to get to all of them, but unfortunately we are kind of getting close to time either way. But just a few things to just wrap this up. When you're looking for sources surrounding death, make sure that you're checking the major ones and maybe ones that you hadn't thought of, like funeral home records, which have been mentioned, court records if you're not finding information, coroner reports, which we've gone over, those death records, understanding what the medical terms mean. Elizabeth, you had some great examples on that. Newspaper, Kurt, bringing up all those newspapers, that was great too. You guys, there's a lot of different resources out there to help you find this information surrounding death. There's a lot of different customs. You can make death really creepy. You can make it really interesting. We just want you to be able to find the information surrounding the deaths that you are interested in.
And you just mentioned it, Allison, and we didn't really have a whisper of a moment to talk about it. There's an amazing amount of information in probate records. And ironically, a week from this evening, we have a program specifically on
probate records.
So, but an awesome amount of information can be found in them. So a week from today, tune in.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. There isn't a handout this evening. Please email us for a copy of the chat. You guys have been amazing with your questions and the discussion in the chat. So thank you all.
Well, thanks, everybody, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Take care.